Welcome to the weekly this week, and it's an international break. The Blues, thankfully for many, aren't back for another Premier League tie after losing 3 matches on the spin to put us bottom of the league when we return and play Aston Villa. Not the most optimistic of fixtures that we come back to. I'm joined by Patric
No.
Ridge, who sort of speaks to me quite a lot, speaks to us quite a lot about the financial issues going at the football club. How are you, mate?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, well, I would say I'm over Saturday, but I don't know if I am. I was at a wedding and went into the speeches and Everton were 2-0 up. And the first speech really was done. It felt a load of, the buzzing on the group WhatsApp that I've been with a few Evertonians, and I was like, something's happening here. It can't be, and then it's like, it can't be good. And yeah, came out and 3-2 down. But watched most of the game back on Sunday, just for some reason, just to try and get a gauge on it. And I'm glad it's the international break in a lot of ways, because I think we already need a break from them, a break from Dyche's, business speak and chucking players under the bus and players chucking the manager under the bus with some performances as well. And then also at the same time, you feel like that was one of them where you really want that next game quickly, isn't it? But I don't know. This time next week, I'll probably be thinking I can do without them. I can do without them for another 2 weeks.
It normally does my head in as well. When you get like 3 weeks into the season, you think like you're massively back. Premier League football feels like everything's returned to normal, and then the international break comes along, and you're like, we've only just had that in July. Why do we need more of this stuff?
Yeah, and you've had your new signings on deadline day, and you want to see everybody, but then
exactly.
And then you're like, it's Everton, so actually,
you can't wait for it already. Just a couple of weeks in. Whilst we've been away from Premier League football and Everton football and all the issues that have come from on the pitch, we watched Sean Dyche did, the way in which we played, the way in which we threw away a 2-0 lead. We'll put that on the back burner on the weekly this week, because there's been a lot more interesting news during the international break when normally it's quite quiet. It hasn't been today, due to what we saw announced that Leicester City will not be punished I should word that correctly, have won their appeal against PSR to be not given any sort of punishment or any points deducted, much the same way that we were deducted points in sort of everyone referred to what happened last season, and Nottingham Forest as well towards the end of last season. I think the first term that comes to mind when everyone was first looked at that being announced was that absolutely irate that this has happened, that they've automatically seemed to have just walked through the door, walked into a courtroom, walked into a committee and just basically said, yeah, that wasn't our fault. We've done nothing wrong. And they've said, you know what? You're right. 0 points. Crack on with the Premier League. Enjoy your new season back. And let's get back to it after the international break. What was your first take on this? Because we initially knew that Leicester would have this issue when they qualified for the Premier League and came back. We spoke just before we started just now about that where the precedent was set, or it wasn't set when we got our punishment. What did you make of this when you first saw it?
So I think what's important to stipulate here first and foremost is it's not necessarily a case of Leicester not doing anything wrong. They definitely have done something wrong. They breached by 24 million, give or take. I think 24.2 million, so more than Everton breached in the 21-22 case, more than Everton breached last year, and give up maybe a bit less than Forest relative to their own band that they had to go within. But Leicester did breach, and the argument was never that they didn't breach. Leicester did over the summer. There was a commission. I'll just get the date of that now. It was in, I believe, 1 second. Sorry, just have to get the date. But I think it was in, so 13th of June. So Leicester, this was like a preliminary hearing, really. So you've got Leicester immediately, when they were charged in March, at the end of March, Leicester immediately fired back and said, we're going to take you to court, essentially, the Premier League. And why Leicester did that is, and when I say court, it went to an independent commission. It wasn't, And why Leicester did that is they essentially said, based on their interpretation of the Premier League's rules, financial rules, Leicester said that we don't feel you had the jurisdiction to charge us. And it all comes down to the fact that when their accounting year ended, which has been the 30th of June 2023, which the one that we're talking about here, technically they weren't a Premier League club anymore because the transfer of shares, the relegated teams take the shares of the give their shares to the newly promoted and vice versa with the FL. The transfer of shares had already happened around 17 days prior. So Leicester's entire case back in June was you don't have the jurisdiction to charge us. Now, the Independent Commission at the time in June threw Leicester's argument out. They said, look, you know that you've breached. You shouldn't really be arguing about whether you were technically in their jurisdiction because kind of the spirit of the rules, as it were, the Premier League have got your bank to rights. You have breached, and you should therefore go to another independent commission, and they should decide your punishment and the level of guilt and all that stuff that comes with it, which is what happened, obviously, previously with Everton and Forest. Now, Leicester didn't accept that, so Leicester used their right to appeal, and that appeal hearing is what has been confirmed today or in the last few days. So Leicester's appeal was successful. So that's essentially, and the Leicester's appeal board, the appeal board agreed with Leicester's take and disagreed with the commission's take. So, and let's face it, one of these independent commissions not making legal errors, to use the term that was used in Everton's first appeal hearing, that's not new. That is what the appeals are for, there to argue the legalities of it and the phrasing, not really the facts. No one here is arguing the facts. So that's important to state, is that, it's not that necessarily they didn't want to charge Leicester, that they didn't want to punish Leicester. It's that Leicester have found their argument to be stronger at an appeal board, and the appeal board, they've swayed the appeal board to throw out what the original commission said in June. And the original commission was going to be, you've got to go to another hearing to find out your punishment. So, fair play to Leicester in that sense. They've had a strong argument. It's definitely cheeky. There's no one saying that. I know Leicester fan or anybody else can say that they weren't banked to rights, that they didn't breach, but they found a way out of it because, in a way, the relegation has saved them and the timing of it. And Leicester also, not to confuse anything, Leicester, and they have the right to do this. Everton have done this in the past. They moved their end of year accounting date from the 31st of May to the 30th of June. They have every right to do that. There's no proof that that was to circumnavigate PSR. I mean, of course it is. They were trying to give themselves more time to sell players if needed, but a lot of clubs have done it. So there's nothing wrong in doing it. And an upshot of this, whether they knew it at the time or not, is that they've managed to fall into this little window where they're kind of in a no man's land between the EFL can't punish them and the Premier League can't punish them. And the irony is, if the Premier League had waited until the 1st of July at 00001 to do the transfer of the shares from Luton to Leicester, then Leicester would have got punished. If Leicester hadn't have gone down, Leicester would have got punished. They'd have already been punished last season because they'd have been in the Premier League, and it would have been like a case of the Forest case and the Everton case for the 22-23 accounts. They'd have already had their punishment. But as it is, they've got out of it, and they were, like, everyone was right. They were bang on for a points deduction. Like, we were okay. We were all right to take that as kind of happening. The original commission said that should happen. But yeah, they've won their argument on appeal, and fair play to the lawyers and fair play to the club for finding the corner. And really, the party that comes out of this looking embarrassed and humbled is the Premier League.
Does this have any anything that can come back to this? Any ramifications from the Premier League? Because what I was reading earlier was that the Premier League could, in theory, come back and appeal against their appeal effectively, but they wouldn't necessarily want to do that given the format that's about to change.
Yeah, I think that there is a bit in there's a bit in the statement. The Premier League they've done a statement saying that they're deeply unhappy with it and surprised and disappointed. But that's life, lads. But yeah, and in that they said they're going to consider all their options. Now, really,
like anyone was really, like anybody.
It feels a bit like when Liverpool said, "Oh, we're going to consider all our options about this thing that happened at Spurs last year." It's like, well, what are your options? You haven't got any options. A bit like Everton saying we'll consider all our options. It's a bit to put it out there. Now, what the Premier League could do is there is a clause for the appeal that, as a standard, you can't appeal an appeal. But there is a clause that it's something like there's just a bit of word in there. It's like in exceptionally rare circumstances. Now, does this count as exceptionally rare circumstances when one party has won an argument essentially based on what the rules strictly say? Because that's what it's come down to. The appeals board, whereas the commission kind of took the rules as for what they mean, the appeal board have sided with Leicester and said, well, that's not how rules work. The rules are the rules. They say what they say. Like, you've got to go with what they say, not what your interpretation of them is. And look, a lot of this PSR stuff, that's been the case all along. And the Premier League, especially in the Everton and Forest case, they've pushed the boundaries as well, as they have every right to do, as their legal team will do. But it's all come down to interpretation of rules. It's all coming down to interpretation of certain aspects. And in the Premier League's argument, their defence was, yes, we know these rules aren't drafted perfectly, but because they aren't drafted perfectly, that gives some leeway for like common sense. And the appeal board have said, well, no, draft them better then. Draft them right how you want it to be. So I don't know if they're going to do that. I think what's most likely is they'll table a motion at the next shareholders meeting or one of them down the line to be, we're going to amend these rules so that this can't happen again, essentially, and that like these teams that fall through the cracks can't fall through the cracks. And the EFL have a rule that basically does that. So there says if a club is promoted or relegated out of the Championship, that club shall, notwithstanding promotion or relegation, remain bound by these as if they were still a Championship club. So until such time as it has complied with all of its obligations. So that if the Premier League's rules had something like that, like a clause like that in place, switch out Championship for Premier League, Leicester would have had to go to a commission and fight again, try and get their points deduction down. But they don't. So I think that's the most likely thing, that they'll table that and the clubs will vote, the shareholders, the clubs will vote on it. And I imagine it'll get put through. I don't know if they, strictly speaking, have to do that to stop this happening. Like, they don't have to do it. Like, there'll be other ways, but I think that seems like, from listening to other people who know, and lawyers and accountants, that seems like the one that they're probably going to go for. But then the rules are changing anyway. And we've currently, for this season, got two tight sets of rules in place. So what does it all mean? And we've all been saying it for months and months and months. But finally, it's coming up. And these journalists, maybe who have always been back in the Premier League side of things, maybe need to take a look at themselves as well and start to realise what people have been saying is correct, that these rules aren't fit for purpose. The people applying them don't know how to apply them properly. And it's all really a bit of guesswork. And it comes down to how good your lawyer has been on the day at arguing your case. And on the day that this appeal hearing was heard, Nick DeMarco absolutely nailed the case for Leicester. But 3 months previously, he hadn't absolutely nailed the case for Forest in their appeal because they didn't get any points back. So it depends which commission and which retired judge or whatever is hearing it on the day. So back to the point, I don't know where the Premier League can go other than changing the rules. And if they are going to appeal, we've seen the stories about them trying to get Everton to pay the full 4.7 million or 4.9 million, and Everton having to pay 2 million of it in the end. Like, if they are to appeal, that's gonna cost a lot more. And are they really going to do it? And if they are doing it, does it just seem overly vindictive again to try and get Leicester 6 points deducted or whatever it will be on the same day that ESPN and a few others are now briefing that they've finally cleared the Chelsea hotel sales to themselves, which should have been cleared nearly a year ago, and they've taken that long to do it and nothing's been done. It's like, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like, it's amateur hour with the Premier League. And from what you said there, sort of get the interpretation that they're sort of trying to save face a little bit if they were to appeal this sort of thing, and what's gone on with Leicester, because you'll have Forest and you'll have ourselves sitting in the background here saying, what on earth is going on here? When we've had to get over that level of punishment, particularly ourselves, not just Forest, given our point deduction was larger than everybody else's. Where do Everton play into this? Would they be straight down to the Premier League, be straight into committees, different things like that and say, listen, what's happened here? Because we had to fight so hard to stay in the Premier League due to the points we got deducted. We've got a side like Leicester, and I was thinking about this today, and this is not verbatim, of course. This is not like actually going to happen. I think you know what I'm going to say here, but Leicester City are probably going to be a side fighting relegation, fighting to stay in the Premier League. Ourselves, given the not to put too fine a point on the first 3 games that we've had, but this is our 4th season where we could potentially be fighting to keep up and go into our brand new stadium as a Premier League side. Everton have got, I don't know if it's a legal case to put towards this. I presume that's not, given what you've just said. But Everton, Forest must be absolutely seething on Leicester not being given anything at all in regards to punishment.
I mean, I'd imagine so, but look, obviously, like I've said before, I'm not a lawyer. I'm sure there's some very clever lawyers and barristers out there eyeing anything up as a legal case because that's your job. And you've got to put yourself out there, haven't you? And there might be avenues they can take, but I don't like on the face of it. This is just a simple case of interpretation of rules that in Everton and Forest case didn't apply. I actually think Forest may be the ones that could feel more aggrieved, not in the sense of overall, but just in terms of this individual case with Leicester, because they're similar in a way that a lot of Forest argument was, well, hang on, we've been in the Championship for the 2 years of this 3-year rolling period. We've spent to try and stay up. Yes, we've overspent, and but we had to spend to try and stay up, and now we've stayed up. You're going to do us anyway, and it's like, whereas Leicester have kind of gone the other way, and because they've gone the other way at a certain time, they've fallen through the crack with it. Like I can imagine that is. I don't know if there's any legal argument there, but there's definitely grievances. And I imagine at those shareholder meetings, I'd like to think Colin Sean or whoever attends them on the part of Everton and whoever attends them on the part of Forest will be pushing Richard Masters and the rest of the Premier League's exec board and be like, sort it out. Like, what is happening here? And at the same time, Everton, we've got to remember, we don't know when it's happening. If it's happened already, is the delayed part of the last year's case about the actual what the amount was and whether certain amounts can be put through or can't be put through. There's that still to decide. Now, in my opinion, the Premier League should have, once Everton dropped their appeal, there should have just been a general thing of, right, let's get on with it now. What does 1 or 2 points matter right now? Let's just try and get through the next season without any of this nonsense again. Like, Everton have learnt the lesson, they've corrected themselves, they're really trying to correct themselves. And we can all see that. And they've had the punishment, and everyone knows PSR have got teeth, but faults, and we are going to change it down the line. Like, that would make sense to me. They've tried to go after Leicester, which fair enough in a way, but Leicester have come back with them with a too good of argument. So yeah, I do think there'll be grievances. Whether they can actually do anything about it, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I'd certainly feel aggrieved taking the fan hat off and just going into those exec meetings. Like, you've got to fight for your club, you've got to fight for your employer, and part of that is putting pressure on the Premier League to get these things right. And the Premier League exec board is only a 3 or 4 people team.
Yeah, I remember saying, yeah.
I mean, I'm sure they earn a fair amount between them. They're good at what they're doing, what they've done before, but clearly at the minute it's a bit of a shambles in terms of how they've been able to get their points across, how these rules have been drafted. The clubs have signed off on them. They're the shareholders, so they take the blame as well. And it's why I think that the most likely outcome is they try and push through a bit of a rule change to stop this happening again. But this is all that by the time it could possibly happen again, we're looking at next year, and then the rules have gone anyway. So, does it matter? But it's come as a surprise, hasn't it? Because everybody did feel, well, based on the precedent that's gone before, the bang to rise. But the difference here is there's no precedent for what's happened with Leicester, because Leicester have found this loophole that Forest and Everton can't really use it as an excuse.
It's ironic, isn't it, that we sort of say about Leicester, it's really good, but they've actually got to do fair play to Leicester, like you said at the start there.
Yeah, I mean, I heard Simon Jordan, I think it was earlier, saying, he fair play to them for how they've got out, fair play to the lawyers, they found a good argument, but they were guilty of sin as well. Like, they've done, and that's where it stings for Evertonians and Forest fans, is we were just getting told you're guilty, so accept your punishment. And it's like, right, so fine, yes, hands up, done. All that happened last season, and yet there's a club here that's more guilty or equally as guilty, depending how you phrase it, with the, with the breach level of breach that have not been done because they got relegated and just happened to transfer their shares 17 days before, sorry. And then on the flip side, Leicester are one of the clubs that was trying to sue Everton for damages and still could sue Everton. And we don't know if they have or not. And I'm sure they probably will try and do, because why wouldn't you try and get a free few million quid? Pay for your legal bills. Yeah, exactly. So it's just a mess of the Premier League's making and the club's making. And obviously there's two ways of looking at it. There's like, well, the rules need to change, absolutely. But then the clubs that voted on these rules and know these rules, they also need to change, and sort their own houses out. But then, we keep going back to it. Chelsea, like they paid UEFA off in last summer because paid UEFA off sounds wrong. They paid UEFA a settlement because UEFA have a statute of limitations that only goes back so far. So UEFA said, right, pay us a fine. I think it was 8 or 9 million. Chelsea paid that. Yet the Premier League and the FA still haven't made a decision about the crime that Chelsea have already owned up to in a settlement with UEFA, it's UEFA. And then on top of that, there's all this stuff about the Abramovich and the Cyprus papers and everything like that going back years. Still nothing on it. And in the meantime, they're letting Chelsea sell hotels to themselves. They're letting them sell the women's team to themselves. Even if they haven't officially confirmed that yet, that's allowed, Chelsea are within the rights to say, well, we think it's allowed and you're not stopping us, so we're going to do it. And then you've got Man United losing money hand over fist. And then finally, yes, the case that stands out of all is Man City. That is very different. I will always side with that. It's like you can't rush that through. But again, that comes back to the Premier League wanting to make a big shock and awe statement a few years ago when they charged City 115 times. Whereas really, when you boil it down, those charges could have been 4 or 5 because so much of them are basically not sending emails. So, yeah, a mess of the Premier League's own making, which people have been saying all along, and the clubs as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's defined how much of a mess that is, really.
Yeah.
One thing I want to ask you.
One more thing, Dave, might be jump onto this, but it doesn't necessarily mean as well that Leicester are going to be safe from a points deduction entirely this season, because they could still, it's going to get complicated here. They look very tight based on what experts are saying for their 23-24 accounts, which are the ones that ended at the end of June this year.
The most recent,
yeah, the most recent ones. So they're one of the clubs, along with Villa, Everton, Newcastle, obviously, and Chelsea, who were under scrutiny. Whether those clubs have done enough, we'll find out down the line. But Leicester, to let saw Sky saying, that means that unlikely to get a points deduction. It's, well, not necessarily. Yeah, they won't get a points deduction for 22-23, but they could still for 23-24, which has to be all sorted out by the end of this season coming. So, yeah, if there's any Leicester fans listening, they've got off the hook for now. They might have done enough because they sold Dewsbury Hall, they sold Harvey Barnes, and Maresca went to Chelsea all in that accounting year. So that might be about 70-80 million for trading profit, which is a lot. But then they went down and they lost 70-80 million in revenue. So yeah, there's maybe there's still some of that on the horizon, but people can worry about that in January, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Two sort of points I want to get to you before we finish. The Premier League's rules that are about to change. What is that, and what impact does that have, perhaps on the likes of ourselves, perhaps on the likes of Manchester City? You've just mentioned there, sort of different ends of the scale.
Well, essentially, they're going to be running. They're running They're running 2 in parallel, and they're bringing anchoring in, which is essentially to keep clubs anchored to I think it's it's whatever the revenue is, or the turnover. The revenue of the lowest earning club in the Premier League. So let's say last season, probably Luton. And then what you can spend is within multiplications of that. Obviously, then and how that ties to PSR. So that's a bit confusing.
That sounds to me in sort of layman terms that they're trying to keep everybody as compact as possible to do things.
Yeah, and
as legal as possible.
Yeah, it's within it will move from like this focus on profit and loss to basically being about what you spend on players, but that includes, salaries, transfer fees, agents fees. So it's not just, oh, you've spent 50 million on a player, but you only have 45 million to spend. You've breached by 5 million. It's obviously a lot more nuanced than that. That's called a squad cost model. That's been voted through. They'll be shadowing that. And then there is this anchoring thing on the table as well. It hasn't quite got through yet, I don't think, but that is a proposal as well. And so you're going to be kind of having these things running in parallel, which are going to be shadowing the current PSR, which are going to end in 2025. So the current PSR are the ones that we're all aware of. Everton have been done under, Forest have been done under, Leicester haven't been done under, but should have been if they didn't find a way around it. The squad cost is what I said. So it's all those salaries, transfer fees, everything like that. And they can only go up to 85% of your revenue. Now, if you're a European team, so your top, seven, it'd be this year, it'd be Man United, it'd be Man United, Chelsea, Man City, Arsenal, Villa, Liverpool, and Spurs would be in it. Yeah. So let's say it was running this year fully. Those 7 teams, they have a lower limit. So I think it drops from 85% to 73 or 75%. So let's call it 75 threes, 75% of the revenue. So they actually, the thing is the bigger squad that you need, the less you can spend within your revenue. But the idea is that your revenue is bigger because you're in Europe. So there has to be that, that trade-off. So this is what UEFA use. And UEFA's punishments tend to be, they don't go around handing out points deductions because obviously they can't for individual leagues. That's on the league to decide. They could only do it in the Champions League or their competitions. So what they do instead is they do a fine initially, and then if it's really serious or they keep on repeating, they might say you can't have 25 players in your squad. It's got to be 20. And then it might be right if that keeps happening, it's more serious. It might be right. You get a points deduction or you're banned from Europe, which is what they did to City because of how serious the City charges were. But City went to CAS, a bit like Leicester have done, and got out of it. So that's essentially what it is. So yeah, can probably send a link because John Blaine, who obviously used to do the business podcast on the Blue Room as well, he knows all about this. He's done a lot of research into it. And he's done some pieces on it as well on the More Than a Game Substack. So they're well worth checking out if you just want a simple layman's term of it. But yeah, essentially it is that. So let's say Everton turn over 200 million, 100 million freeze, because I'm not good at maths, 100 million this season. They'd be allowed to spend 85 million of that on transfers, salaries, agents fees, etc. But at the minute, well, I don't know if it's at the minute, but Everton were a few years ago. They were at like 110% of their, they were well above their revenue. And this is the issue where it comes in. Like clubs have still got to work it down. A lot are at like 90, 95% of it's basically been spent on wages and fees, which is.
So that means they've got to sell players basically for that sort of thing to get revenue back.
You sell players and you can't replace them unless you're bringing in a massive fee and shedding a lot of wages off the book. So Everton, obviously, bring it to Everton because they're a good example.
That's what I wanted to ask. Yeah.
We were around 92%, 93% a few years ago. I think that might be 22. So we'll have brought it down and bring it down. Andre Gomez, Yerry Mina, Fabian, all those players that have gone off the books and not being replaced on big wages. That is really strong for the squad cost model. Like it will help. Will it help enough? Hopefully, by the time it comes in fully in a year's time, yes. And the hope is that your revenue is better because you're finishing higher up the league. Obviously, we've been hit by a points deduction that, shoved us down, 4 places last year? That's 10 million that we've lost there and then. And then you factor in all the legal fees and everything that comes with that. That's the frustrating thing because that extra 10 million could mean you're already in the black. And but yeah, this is where we are.
Well, that's just the final point. Question to you: we sold Onana for what was it, 50 odd million?
Yeah, 50, 55, I think. Yeah.
So that to me, look at the players we've gone and got in. The money we've spent on Ndai and various players we've come and brought in. Why are Everton available to do that? Is it as simple as me looking at that saying we've got 50 million in for Onana, we can just go and spend that?
Well, there's a few little things here. So I think in June, when there was all that stuff about Branthwaite and Man United found out the hard way that Everton weren't actually that desperate to sell. So I think there maybe been a bit of, and Everton did box clever in June because the Dobbin thing was massive because that was 10 million pure profit. It doesn't matter about Irabunan coming in because that's not how it works for incomings, but outgoings, that's 10 million straight into the books. That was huge because not one of us were thinking at the end of May, we're going to sell Dobbin for 10 million. You know, and that's whatever you think, that is good business and a way around the rules. Again, let's face it, that's what it was. But we got a decent player in return by the looks, and it really helped our books. Then we got Godfrey out, which again, I don't think fans have really been considering. Like, would we get that money for Godfrey? Well, we sold Godfrey for what, about 11, 12 million, 10, 10 to 12 million. But yes, so we made a loss on him technically because we bought him for 22 million or 20 million. But in PSR terms, we made a profit because of how it works. So how a book profit works. So you divide, let's say 20 million by 5-year contract. So Godfrey had 4 million left on his book value. We got 10 million for him. We're 6 million up straight away. So that's 16 million there. So I think Everton were in a stronger position. And then they knew that Onana was going. So they knew that they could probably get through that June deadline and be just about okay, which suggests if there was a breach, it was somewhere around below the 16 million mark because we've brought in that money. But then they've also got Onana coming. And for PSR terms, I think the numbers, this is off the top of my head, but the numbers would have been around 28 million for PSR positive, which is really good. You know, like we bought him for 30. Yeah, we bought him for 30, 5-year contract. So that's 6 million, 6 million. So that's 12 off in total. 18 million left, sold him for 50, 20. So yeah, 32 million. But then we had a 4 million fee that we had to pay Lille, and that takes it down to 28 million for PSR. So that's how you get to that number. So if you look at it in the PSR terms, Everton are good. But then on the flip side, we have the actual thing of the cash flow and where's the cash coming from. And you said there about the players we spent it on. You know, it all works in different ways, but we spent those initial fees that we'll have paid for Ndai and O'Brien and Lindstrom, obviously with his loan fee. They probably amounted to in total around about 10 million. And that's not necessarily because we didn't have the wiggle room with PSR. It's because we just didn't have the cash. Like we didn't. It's like, well, yeah, in theory, in this pie in the sky accounting whale, we've got loads of wiggle. We've got some wiggle room, but I've only actually got 20p and a Mars bar in my pocket. And the days of the days of wheeling and dealing and maybe chucking in a Pringle, they're long gone. So we that's where we were. So the Onana money did come in, 50 million, but it wasn't a case of, right, we've now got 50 million, we can spend all that 50 million. When you look at what we spent, I think if you just do it on fees, we brought in around 70 million in total through the window, 75 million. And we've spent around about 50 million of it just in fees. But, you know, you've got to think of that as just, so like we're 25 million up, but in PSR terms, we've got a bit more wiggle room. But actually, when you look at it, what we could spend, and it's why we had so much frustration at the end of the window, we didn't have any money. And that's probably because the 50 million that's come in from Onana, really we're using that down the line to think worst comes to the worst. If Texter's takeover falls through, look what happened with the Freaking Group. You know, you've got to have that money there, haven't you, as a reserve to think, well, there is some money to keep everything going if push comes to shove. So I think, you know, if we'd have seen the Freaking takeover go through, I think we'd have seen a bit more of that money reinvested. If we'd have seen Dominic Calvert-Lewin leave, we'd have obviously seen that money reinvested, and he'd have been a huge boost for PSR because he didn't cost. He's like, his book value now is pretty much nothing. So yeah, it's obviously a tough situation. If we could have got one more out, we'd probably been able to spend a bit more than we did. But I think, you know, we've got a box clever, and I'd rather them do it that way, and I'd rather them say, look, we're not going to risk the future of the club because we need to panic buy a striker, you know, because at the end of the day, we've missed out on the winger that we wanted all summer, which is frustrating, but we've then got a loan panicked, bought a striker anyway for free. So we might as well just do it that way. So, yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question. I know it's a bit of a convoluted way, but yeah, it's not just as simple as the money in, the money out. That money that has come in, unfortunately, within a position where it's got to at least be put into a savings account in case you need it. You know, It's gone straight into Everton's Chase account, earning 4.1% interest for the Kevin Tellwell's got 50 of them set up and he's put $1 million in each. So, you know, this is how we're doing it. And then one of them's for the Christmas present. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's an excellent way of putting it. So, again, just to finish up what we were talking about there, Everton are clear of PSR
Well,
of what's come recently.
I hope they are. I think the feeling is from the club and those around the club that there wouldn't have been that. I mean, look, Everton have taken us all for fools in the past, haven't they? So who knows? But I think the feeling around the club is that there wouldn't have been that level of confidence at the end of June to not kind of panic and have to sell Branthwaite or another big player by the end of June if we were really in a dire position. And worst comes to the worst, if they do go ahead with this second part of the case and Everton lose it, then obviously that'll change the numbers a bit. But I think then the Anana money will be able to be counted in last year's accounts. So because it was so close to the end of June, it went through in at the 20th of July in the end. But we know, again, precedent, we know from the Forest case that if you can prove that the deal was in the works, that you had every intention to sell the player, and that it went through in a reasonable amount of time after that June 30th deadline, you're going to be, your accounting period deadline, you're going to be okay. So worst comes to the worst, I don't think they'll need it. But if they do, they've got an arms to throw in as well. And then they can sell probably Branthwaite, sadly, by the end of this season's accounts. So I think the feeling is that they're okay. But, you know, like I said, they've taken us for fools before. And if this other case, this second part of the case from last year does go ahead and does go against us, that will change the numbers. So probably no one count the chickens, but I do think we don't have to maybe worry about any 10-point or 6-point deductions or anything like that. Like if it did happen, if we did breach, I think it'd be very, very close. And I think Everton would have some serious mitigation as well. And, you know, the punishment might even be like very, very minimal, very negligible, because the breach might be so small. So, you know, I'll look an idiot in 3 months' time when it's revealed that we breached by 50 million. But fingers crossed, it looks like we might be not out of the woods, but getting there. And now it's more of a cash flow issue, which is obviously something to worry about as well.
And finally, we owe a load of money out to various companies. That is a completely separate issue to what we've just spoken about for the past half hour.
Yeah, it's well, I mean, I would have to be an accountant to know exactly how that works with PSR. It obviously, like, look, the interest payments on the stadium ultimately did us or helped or contributed to doing Everton in 21-22 accounts in that case, and even in the last one, and that's what they're still arguing about. So those interest payments, they are an issue. So owing money is an issue, but it's more of an issue for the cash flow perspective. Like, we go back to, where's that Anana money gone? Well, probably gone in Lang O'Rourke's pocket, to be honest. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's got to go somewhere. So yeah, that is an issue for the club's future. That is an issue for anyone looking to take it over. You know, we've got around about 200 million of 777 debt. That's not payable until 2026, but is obviously a problem because, you know, people who are going to take over, like Freaking, that they don't want to pay that. Like, what is, you know, especially when it's such a dodgy thing anyway, and like 777 are ceasing to exist, and that. So, like, why should we have to owe money to a company that doesn't exist anymore? And then you've got RMF, who are obviously there in the background. But RMF, like, why would RMF call in their debt when they benefit from a club taking ages to pay them back? That's their model. That's why they're just some shady, with no employees, set up from a random office in Cheshire. It's like, well, their model is lend money out and, you know, don't get it back for 25, 50 years. But it doesn't matter because of the interest. You're going to double, triple what you put out in the first place. Yeah. So, you know, it's why the administration talks were always a bit, to me, it's like, well, who's going to call it in? Because everyone's benefiting from it keeping going, which is sad, but it is where it is. And then, yeah, the money that we now are, I guess, the most pertinent one, which is up in 25, is the Freaking Group. So they obviously put the money up to pay MSP off. So we got a loan to pay off a loan. which I think everybody's probably done that at one point. I remember I did that when I was younger because it was a favourable rate to get that, and you get it down and eventually. So it's kind of like that, but it's on a much bigger scale. And I guess the thing with Texter, if he does get it done, or whoever else gets it done, one of the stipulations will be, right, you also need to pay this off, like Freaking paid MSP off. And it kind of just keeps kicking the can down the road. Now, what we want, obviously, ideal world, is someone to come in and say, right, I'm going to pay that off. 777, I'll give them the 200 million, or say maybe, right, I'm not giving you 200 million, but you can have 150 now, and we'll pay the rest in installments over the next 100 years or whatever. And then, clear all the debt, but it's not realistically going to happen. So I think the best we can hope for maybe is just someone who's going to consolidate that debt, maybe pay it all off in lump, and then it all goes to one person, or one entity. So if that is John Texter and he comes in and he says, right, I will wipe out all this debt, all these they'll all be paid, but it's all going on to me, so that's probably the way forward. But I might be talking rubbish there. There might be another way out of it. I'm just thinking, if you put your business hat on, what are you going to do as a billionaire wanting to buy a football club? You want something out of it, don't you? And you want some level of guarantee. But, maybe John Textor or someone else really just does love the idea of Everton that much that they're willing to do it. And wouldn't that be brilliant? What's McCartney up to? He needs to put his money where his mouth is, doesn't he? Jesus Christ.
Brilliant.
Gallaghers can get that together, Paul. You can stump 100 million and clear some debt.
Absolutely. He did sort of say one time he was a Blue, didn't he? And then he said,
his
dad was an Evertonian, but he really liked the ball.
Geez, what's he worth? He must be worth nearly $1 billion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Taylor, get that gig ready get those stadiums ready next year and stadium ready next year. Say to Taylor, come back over to the UK and bring you. Invest in a football club. Everyone else is doing it. He goes out with an NFL player. What's done it? Tom Brady's done it.
Exactly, mate. You could get away.
Just got to pay off all this. Don't worry about this 700 million worth of debt. That just needs paying off, and then everything's yours.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's it. And get some Oasis concerts in there as well. It seemed impossible to get, and the money you'd have to pay for them. But as always, mate, since we spoke a few months ago about the Evertonian situation, if you were to compare the two of them, it's a much more healthier condition. I'm sure you'll agree. Even though never fully out the woods, but then when are we ever out the woods with our football club?
It does seem a bit brighter. It just now needs to get brighter on the pitch, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, mate. Absolutely. We'll return to all that next week, no doubt, when we're previewing to play Aston Villa. But, mate, thanks so much, as always, for joining us. And let me know in sort of layman terms about what's going on, given Leicester and how that sort of follows on to what us and Everton are sort of having to consider. And, hopefully back for our fourth game in the Premier League. Go and get 3 points against Aston Villa and stop worrying about going down. Thanks as always, mate. Really appreciate your time.
No worries. Thanks.